the very first workshop that we're going to have in our workshop series for summer holidays, IV pre-tournament engagement. There are a series of topics we are going to cover, but for this session, we're going to cover something under legality. And it's something that we've seen come up a lot in our spas at Vacationspars. So I reached out to a professional friend of mine, and she's agreed to help us out with this session today. We have with us Ms. Enyonam Aksoua Apedo. She is with Afrimo Advisors PRUC, and she has a deep professional understanding of global trade. Therefore, the conversation we are going to have today would be on global trade. After the session, I would ask some questions that debaters would find very useful on how to apply this knowledge she would give us in debate. And you're welcome, and thank you for agreeing to do this to help the Vacationspars community. The debaters are eternally grateful.
Hello, Nana. Thank you for this opportunity. It's a pleasure to share the knowledge I know with your team and anyone who might come across the video as well. So, thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you too. Thank you too, really.
Just
Um, we
come
can,
to say hello.
hi, yeah, I can
Yeah.
see you.
Okay.
I can see you. Okay, great. So as discussed, we would love to cover the session on issues relating to global trade and global commodity chains. So I would just like hand over the reins to you, and then you would take us through everything you think we should know and how we should be applying this when we have debates that resonate with such a theme.
Right. So we would I'll start generally by talking about what global trade is, or sometimes called international trade. It basically involves buying and selling of goods and services between countries. So buying and selling between Ghana and Nigeria, Ghana and the US, Ghana and the UK. So it's just the exchange of goods, services, and even capital across borders. And it helps to enable countries to basically specialize in the production of a particular good or service, and also sometimes to help other countries or even countries that export or import to diversify their products and also sometimes drive their economic growth. So that's basically what global trade is about. And to start off, we would, or I would talk about how global trade um, benefits us, or the importance of global trade. So, as I mentioned, it's to help us to drive economic growth in the sense that if you, as a country, you need a certain product or you need a certain service, you would, and you can't find it within your borders, or the people in your country do not produce such products, or you don't have skilled personnel in that field, you can easily reach out to another country that has the personnel or that has the products or even the resources you need to develop that sector. So, for instance, Ghana wants to build more roads, develop infrastructure in a particular community. So I'll narrow it down to maybe Accra. So we want to build more roads, construct more roads. We want to plan the towns in such a way. I'll use the issue of flooding because that's what happened. That's the most recent challenge that Accra has faced. So you want to construct roads and plan the town in such a way that you Accra doesn't flood, or the issue of flooding is either minimized or cleared altogether. And then you realize that there's people in, say, China that have the expertise to clear flooding altogether, Ghana can reach out to China for that particular thing to be solved, that challenge to be solved. So that's it about the benefits. And I'm just using this as an example, not to say that we don't have the skilled personnel in Accra or in Ghana, but just to give a fair understanding of what goes on in international trade or global trade. So this has to do with services. The example I just gave has to do with services, but you could also have the case where it's products. So in Ghana, say we need lithium. We don't produce lithium in Ghana and we want to generate, say, batteries or tools or machinery that needs lithium, we can reach out to countries that mine or extract lithium naturally, and then we can get those products as well. Now, you would notice that I've spoken about economic growth and focused on our challenges and trying to develop certain areas of Accra as a focus. But one question that people would ask is, does global trade or does international trade really benefit everybody? Now, the thing about global trade is that it's aimed at benefiting countries so that every country benefits from trade relations with one country or the other. It could just be two countries, so like a bilateral relation or even multilateral, where there's a trade relation between, say, Ghana, Togo, and Ivory Coast. So that's multilateral because there's more than two countries involved. But there, when people even in normal interactions or relations, when people deal with each other, some people might at some point feel disadvantaged or feel they do not benefit as much from the relationship as the other party does. The goal of international trade or one of the theories of international trade or global trade is for comparative advantage in the sense that every country focuses on what they can produce most efficiently. So, say Ghana, we are known to be the producers of gold, so and cocoa. I mean, not producers of gold as in we produce it, but it's naturally found in Ghana. And so gold, cocoa. So then Ghana, for instance, focuses on gold and cocoa for exports so that we do not have to deal with, say, lithium because we do not really have lithium in our country. So we focus, so the comparative advantage is okay, as Ghana, what you have, focus on that and export or make it available to other countries. Then the US also focuses on what they have, then they make it available to other countries. Togo does same, Nigeria does same. But the challenge is that when you have people focusing on, or when you have, say, Africa mostly focusing on just raw materials, because you realize that Africa is just sending out raw materials. So you have people sending out gold, cocoa, and mineral resources and all of that produce to the Western world and other countries. So they mainly focus on that. And then they then because they are developed countries and have high value manufacturing industries, would be the ones who would benefit in the end. Because if you meet anybody and you're giving them, say, cocoa and chocolate, they would obviously pick the chocolate over the raw cocoa. There are even people who do not know what raw cocoa looks like. So they would, but everybody knows about chocolates. Everybody wants a bite of chocolate. So in the end, those who have produced the chocolates would be the ones to get the wealth from it. And it's just like a theory of the rich getting richer. So the developed countries are going to continue to be developed at the expense of developing countries because we just send out raw materials. And you notice that there are even in there was a time when I came across a video and there was a farmer who had no idea what chocolates look like. But he had been I mean he produces or he has a cocoa farm, he extracts, is exported, and here he is giving a bar of Kit Kat chocolates, golden tree chocolates, and he doesn't know that, oh, what I've worked so much for, this is what it's turned into in the end. And it's quite sad to know that. So that's one of the major disadvantages or major reasons why people believe strongly that global trade does not benefit everybody. Yes, and with trade agreements or trade relations, there's no power dynamic in the sense that we don't the parties or countries don't come together as better than you, so I would trade with you to take advantage of you. You know, once you get into trade relations with another country, you are equals because every nation is a sovereign state in the sense that every nation has authority and has some power over its territory. So Ghana is sovereign, Nigeria is sovereign, Kenya is sovereign. So if Ghana decides to enter relations with Kenya, then Ghana is seen as equal to Kenya. If Ghana decides to enter into trade relations with China, Ghana is seen to be as equal to China in the sense of we are all sovereign states. But if you should look at it really, China might not be on the same pedestal as Ghana. Same with Ghana, USA. We might be seeing ourselves as equal states in the transaction, but we've just there's a dynamic there, there's an existing dynamic there where US obviously has US as a developed country is better or at certain things than Ghana or more developed in a certain sense than Ghana. But then we like to see it as okay, we are equal states, but in reality, we are not. They might be accumulating wealth and making more of the trade relations than we are. So that's it for the disadvantages of trade relations or some of the disadvantages that may be pointed out. So, after talking about these disadvantages, I would like to also talk about some of the theories people have concerning global trade or explaining the inequalities in global trade. So, there's the world systems analysis, and it was developed by a sociologist called Emmanuel Wallenstein. I hope I got the name right. And so basically, for him, he's saying that the world is a global economy and it's a single interconnected system. So we are all one in a sense. So we are all so it's like a system, one country linked to the other one, but there's no break anywhere. So we are all interconnected. And then but then there is a division. So there's the division where there's the wealthy states or the developed states where they have they are capital intensive, they have high skill and production, they have large machinery, they have like intellectual property ownership. And then you have the um, developing states or less developed states that supply the raw materials to these wealthy states. So many African countries basically fall in these regions because we are the developing nations, of course, and also certain Latin American nations as well. So we just produce or supply the raw materials or in some cases cheap labor to these strong states. And then there's the in-between. These are the states that are they are not necessarily developed, but they are also not developing. They are like somewhere in between the two. So this system basically talks about how, you know, even though there's we believe that there's a single interconnected system. There's differences in the countries. So, as debaters, or since this session is focused towards debaters, I'm sure there'll be like a question where you say, or for debates about why Ghana is poor, or to frame it better, what specific international treaties or trade relations or intellectual property laws prevents Ghana from moving from a developing country to a developed state, or from basically from being a developed state. Now, I'm going to focus on this session like a debater would. With my understanding of a debate, or what I think of a debate, is that you have one side arguing for the motion and you have one side arguing against the motion. I believe that both sides make very valid or salient points that need to be taken into consideration, because in reality, we do not have just one side being right. Both sides make very valid points. And so that will be the reality on ground. So if you're asking the question about why Ghana is not being developed or why Ghana is still poor, some people might argue strongly that Ghana isn't poor. We have resources. We have gold. We have valuable mineral resources. We have valuable agricultural resources. So we can't be poor. And they are in a sense right, because gold is valuable. We mine diamond as well. There are other mineral resources, and there's revenue generated from certain industries. There are lots of mining companies operating in Ghana. So in that sense, they are right. But then there are also people that are arguing that, oh no, Ghana is poor because these mineral resources, or the fact that we possess these mineral resources, is not reflected on the lifestyle of the people. It's not reflected on the way people go about their on the ordinary person's standard of living. And they would also be right. So you'd have to look at it generally, or as debaters, sometimes you have to look at both sides to make valid points for whatever side you are on, because at the end of the day, you want your side to win. But then both points, or points from both sides, would help you have a clear understanding of whatever you are asked to debate. And so, in this setting, talking about how Ghana's position would influence its development opportunities. If Ghana focuses mainly on sending out raw materials without making an effort to translate these raw materials into something of value. So, for example, well, there's golden tree chocolate in Ghana, but say, I think that's, well, in recent times there are more chocolate producing um factories or institutions in Ghana, and we have cocoa, so that's a good thing. And but then, even with being known as the highest, or the number one producers of cocoa in the world, we are not known for producing the number one chocolate in the world. People like Swiss chocolate and stuff. And you need to understand that if Ghana wants to move, using cocoa as a focus, if Ghana wants to move from being um, a developing nation to a developed nation with cocoa as a focus, that's one thing we could do. We could build industries. We could focus on producing things of value with chocolates, with cocoa, sorry. So, for instance, well, now we know chocolate. Chocolate is everywhere, but what if someone or Ghana can decide to produce something else with cocoa that would be valuable to the world, that other countries will have need of, and then we would capitalize on that, and then gradually we will make the needed revenue to move from being a developing state to being a developed state. I do not say that there's no other factors as well, because we have the issue of proper governance systems, other economic related issues, corruption, all of that. But this could be a step in getting there. Now we would move to talking about the legal architecture behind unequal exchanges. So, what legal frameworks or what legal policies have been put in place that have, in a way, enabled there to be unequal exchange? Because, as I mentioned from the beginning, global trade is to help everybody get to a certain level, or every country gets to a certain level. So you have people from Ghana getting the resources they need from other countries, people from other countries getting the resources they need from Ghana, and then we are all being balanced out. But then we are at a point where we are seeing this unequal exchange. So, what legal framework have been put in place that have enabled this to happen? And laws in general are put in place to ensure some form of order, or to ensure that society is shaped in a certain way or follows a certain path. So if you have a law that says maybe you cannot go out on Saturdays and Saturdays are for cleaning, it's maybe just to ensure the orderliness of cleanliness in a particular community, just to ensure that, okay, we have this law so everybody is clean and our communities are clean. So in international trade as well, we have international trade laws, we have international trade policies, we have international trade agreements or charters, which are put in place to ensure that there's some form of order in, or a systematic way for nations to relate with each other in relation to trade activities, basically. And so I would talk about three things at this level. We have trade laws and trade escalations. So with this, they are the trade laws that are put in place to ensure that there's this order, or in states relating with each other, for instance. In certain situations, these very trade laws that have been put in place to ensure that there's order are the same laws that cause the inequality between states. So you may have some trade laws that are aimed at reducing, say, tariffs, but then they might not necessarily be reducing tariffs for all countries, because if you are giving tariffs to USA and Ghana, USA is in a certain economic position that Ghana might not be. And so it might seem like a reduction to the USA, but not to Ghana. And if you place, so for instance, they can also place like very low import duties. So with this one, there are instances where there are low duties on raw materials like cocoa, and then there will be high tariffs. Let me not use import duties. Let me use tariffs so that it's cut across the various taxes that might be required to be paid in trade, international trade relations. So there may be tariffs that are put on um high value goods. So using cocoa and chocolate once again. So someone goes to trade with another country and it's cocoa, and then there are relatively lower tariffs to be paid. And then someone also goes to have trade relations with another country to either import or export chocolate, and then the tariffs are high. And okay, I have the cocoa, I have the chocolate. Obviously, I would opt for the cocoa, to send out the cocoa. So maybe Ghana is opting to send out cocoa because it's relatively cheaper to send out cocoa than to send out chocolate. And in the end, it suppresses our attempts at industrialization, because if you are going to add value to your resources and you would not make any benefits from it, then why not leave it in their basic form when people have value for it? And so that's it with trade laws that are put in place, and then the tariffs that may escalate at some point. You also have like intellectual property. So you'd have people, so Ghana sending out cocoa, and then the Swiss developing maybe the best chocolate in the world, or high quality standard chocolate in the world. And in they developed it, so it's their intellectual property. I mean, this session is focused on international trade laws or trade relations, but I'll just chip in something about international intellectual property laws. So if you are the creator of something, you have the rights over that thing in a way, in a sense, to use the most basic words to explain it. So you create chocolates, it's your own formula, you put that all together. You have a sense of ownership and protect. You can get a sense of protection over that. So, and that if you truly were the originator of it, and there's nothing of the sort anywhere else in the world, or there's something unique about it that you came up with. So the Swiss have developed these chocolates, and so it's unique to them. They have protection over it. They have trademarks over it and all of that, patents and all of that. They will obviously not willingly share that information with Ghana, so that Ghana also produces similar or even better chocolates by improving on their formulas. And then now Ghana is the better country in the sense that they would be the ones known as the producers of the best chocolate in the world. They would rather come to Ghana for the cocoa and go and do that. So sometimes these intellectual property protection laws that are aimed at protecting the intellectual property of certain countries or certain organizations within certain countries end up being the very problem of other countries, because they will not be able to have access to certain knowledge to improve on their resources. For instance, in Ghana, there's the Ghana Patent Act, and in that act, where there's a conflict in law in relation to international intellectual property treaties, for instance. The international laws take precedence over domestic laws in conflict, right? So then now, if there's a law, or there's a challenge on paying of exorbitant licensing fees, or local manufacturing companies are having some challenges in that sense in relation to capital and all of that. And then the international treaties raises a higher standard than the domestic laws of Ghana. And because of this conflict, and obviously because of this provision, we have to go with the inter international treaties. And then we would still suffer in the end. So we have to pay attention to all of these. When there are bilateral investment treaties as well, there is um there is some form of challenge, in the sense that if Ghana and say Germany enter into an investment agreement, or there's some laws in Ghana about the people that can invest in Ghana, and then there's the laws in US about the people that can invest in Germany, and then you have these bilateral treaties. You realize that sometimes there's um there's a when it comes to economical, or when there's a financial need, the developed countries are always, or most likely than not would have a greater advantage over the less developed country. Sometimes the multinational corporations can bypass domestic courts and sue states, or say Ghana. Germany and Ghana have an issue. They'll sue a state in international arbitration tribunals. Not to say that international arbitration tribunals are not good, but then most of the time the developed states like to choose the forum and all of that for settlement of arbitration and of settlement of disputes, sorry, and they rely on arbitration and all of that. And sometimes relying on the domestic laws would actually be favorable to the developing nation, but because of the bilateral investment treaty between the parties, it might not be so. There's also the instances in relation to investments in general. There's also instances where you cannot invest. There's requirements for investments in for foreigners to invest in various countries. So in Ghana, you require a certain amount of money to per the GIPC Act as a foreigner to invest in Ghana. So that's a form of international trade, by the way. And then, so imagine that in Ghana, you need 1 million cedis as a foreigner to invest in Ghana. And then in US, they state that you need $1 million. These figures are not accurate figures. They are just a representation to give a fair idea. So in US, they also require that you need 1 million US dollars to invest in US or for trade related matters. And then the ordinary Ghanaian investor or the ordinary Ghanaian producer will not be able to raise that 1 million dollars to go and invest in or have those trade relations with the US, and that's kind of problematic. There's also the corporate liability gap. So when it comes to companies and people, companies are considered a separate legal personality. So say I have a company with Nana. Different from, and okay, our company is called Vacationspars, just an example. Our company is different from us in the sense that you can sue Vacationspars separate from us. Our company is seen as a legal person, while we are also seen as our own people, like persons by ourselves. So based on these, the there are times where parent companies of from developed countries or foreign nations dissociate or separate themselves from their subsidiaries in certain countries. So in Ghana, you might have like a nation, an institution or organization that has their parent company in, say, US, and then they are committing certain um for lack of a better word, abusive acts to the environment or to human rights. These subsidiaries are sometimes going to be held liable for those acts instead of the parent companies, when sometimes the instructions really and truly came from the parent companies and the subsidiaries carried them out. At this point, I would move to talk about case studies or how um, this information is relevant to you as debaters. So, for instance, we have the issue of cocoa supply chains in West Africa. So, in West Africa, we have Ghana, we have Cote d'Ivoire producing cocoa, but they only benefit from a very small percentage of what is made off of chocolates or cocoa products in general. In the same, they do not have even though they produce the raw material, which is cocoa, they do not have any control over the processing, the manufacturing, the branding, the change in value of the cocoa in itself. So, yes, you've given us the cocoa, but it's basically okay at this moment, what you do with us is on us. So, maybe we're going to make white chocolate, we're going to make chocolates with nuts, we're going to do this, we're going to name it this way, we're going to choose these colors for branding purposes, all of that. You don't have any control at that point. Once you've handed over the raw materials to us, that's on us, and then they do the branding and everything, and then um you don't have any benefits from it, right? Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire produce like over 60% of the world's cocoa, but our farmers don't have any um say in like what goes into the branding, as I've already mentioned. And they also and these the things that are protected by intellectual property really or benefits the developed countries in terms of economic or financial gains. The farmers do not have the control or the benefits of that. They are, if I'm minded to say, the lowest in the value chain. And even in recent times, you have at some point the European Union banning chocolates or cocoa products that have been generated from, say, deforestation activities or say um, um, cocoa sourced from farms where children or people below a certain age worked on. So you can buy like a bar of chocolate and then it's written, they write clearly on it that cocoa not from child labor activities, just to, give the impression that we are not abusing any human rights laws in sourcing our chocolates from Ghana. We do not use children in the production, they are from relevant places that have followed all the relevant labor laws and all of that, just to, sometimes close the gap or solve the inequalities. But the problem remains that there are farms that um, use children for the harvesting of these cocoa, and then the cocoa is transported by institutions or organizations in Ghana and exported. And obviously, those institutions were not even the point of, they were not on the farm, or they were not the ones who collected the cocoa. So these institutions maybe got them from an individual, and the individual exports the cocoa, the raw material, and then, okay, we didn't use child labor. And truly, from that point, they wouldn't be able to tell that they didn't use child labor. So the problem will persist. And so that's it for that. And sometimes there's the issue of technology supply or e-waste. Let me put it that way. Sometimes the developed states have the obligations or um, are allowed to provide incentives that promote technology transfer to the least developing or the least developed countries, but they are not compelled to. If developed states have some information or some data or some policy framework that is helping them to gain financially from certain trade activities. They are not compelled to give that information to or least developed countries so that they would also benefit from it. Yes, they might be encouraged to, but there's no punishment really if they decide not to follow those laws. And even see Cantamanto, for instance, there's always like dumping of clothes, like secondhand clothes, fairly used clothes, all of that. And they just send it over to I'm using Ghana as a focus, of course. So they just send it over to Ghana. And even in recent times, there's been campaigns against it. So you find billboards completely covered in secondhand clothes or, those kinds of clothes completely covered in as a way to, raise a voice against that. And these wealthy nations sometimes when they bring it, they don't bring it in the form of trade, like okay, we are selling to you or something. Sometimes they even bring it as, charity or in a way that seems like they are helping us, but in reality, we are not benefiting from it. There's conventions. There's a Basel Convention that speaks about the control of transboundary movements of hazardous waste. So it's just to stop like developed countries from dumping whatever toxic waste they don't want again in less developed countries. So like maybe they don't need a certain chemical again or it's being called whatever, then they'll just ship it down to less developed countries because it might have had some benefits to them, but then the disadvantages that has accrued from it is greater than the benefits that they might be getting. So they would then looking at the options, say, okay, let's just send it to them and tell them about the benefits. But in essence, it's also causing a lot of harm to us. So the convention is basically to stop that from happening. But you realize that sometimes it does continue. There's Agbogboloshi in Accra, which at some point was classified as the second or third. Well, I don't remember the ranking exactly, but it was one of the most toxic places in the world because of um the the e-waste that had been gathered there, you know. So there are some misconceptions in general. And one of them is that trade or international trade automatically benefits everyone equally. No, it doesn't. Sometimes you need to have like when I mentioned the bilateral investment treaty, sometimes you need to have specific clauses or phrases that will ensure that as a less developing country, the power dynamic of the developed country does not overshadow you. So you have certain important clauses in there to ensure that you are still at equal level with the developed country, or even as the developed country, if you feel the need to add certain clauses so that you are not at a disadvantage in relation to the less developed country, you have to put that in place. And you also need to know that another misconception is that poor countries are sometimes poor solely because of the domestic corruption or other factors that I mentioned earlier. You sometimes, yes, we do not close our eyes or overlook the issues of corruption and other related matters, but sometimes it's not solely because of the corruption. Sometimes we need to ensure that we are putting in measures in place to become like an industrialized nation to make the most out of the resources we've been blessed with the skills that we already have. If what with what we already have, build on it instead of leaving what we have trying to get from other places. Why not develop what we have? Why not build what we have? Why not put in measures in place, training programs, skill development, capacity building, all of that to ensure that we are at a certain level with people that are bringing in things of value, because really and truly everybody wants the valuable thing over the thing in its rawest form or most raw form. Nobody wants that. And then also, sometimes we believe that our natural resources are like most beneficial, and it's like having um the highest amount of money you can have in your hand. Yes, it looks good in your hands. If right now you have like $1 million, $1 million in your hands, it might look good in your hands, but what are you doing with the $1 million? What are you putting to use with it? It can Someone can have $1 million and then it will sit in their room with them. And if you're not putting it to use, obviously, even though monetarily or financially you are wealthy, you will not benefit from the wealth because you have done nothing with the $1 million. And it's the same with our resources. If we have the gold, if we have the cocoa, if we have all of that, but we do not process it even domestically to supply our domestic industries and people within the country, we will merely have the national wealth in that sense and not have the potential or the value added potential that the foreign nationals add to it when it is traded in that. So that's basically what it is for international trade relations and global trade relations. So at this point, if you'd have, I think that I've come to the conclusion
Mhm.
of what I have to say, but you have to consider a lot of factors. Just to add lastly, that you have to consider a lot of factors when it comes to international trade, because international trade is not as simple as trade locally. You know, even locally, sometimes you have to bargain, sometimes you have to pay extra because of certain add-ons. There are places where you go and there's a basic price where, okay, you can get the thing for 50. Everybody that comes in gets it for 50. But if you come and you want extra something, the price goes up and all of that. So you have to consider all of these in international trade, and then also consider how you can position yourself to benefit from the trade relations, basically. So that will be it for today. Thank you very much.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Enyo. This has been very insightful. I think I learned a lot. I was taking notes and following you. I do have some questions I would like to ask. I think it's really going to put some things into perspective, and it's going to just be very useful moving forward because those are questions that keep popping up in spars and sessions that we have in vacation spars. So the first thing on my mind I would want to ask, because you did cover this at some point in your presentation about intellectual property laws. My question is, should developing countries deliberately weaken their intellectual property protections so they can accelerate their industrialization? Because oftentimes we encounter discussions that put forward the idea that, oh, China did this. China weakened their intellectual property enforcement during the periods where they were trying to industrialize. Maybe South Korea and Taiwan also copied those models. And now, as we can see, these nations, they are innovation leaders. So should like countries in Latin America and West Africa, for example, also be allowed to adopt similar strategies? Or should we really just strictly respect these international IP rules from the jump whenever we sign these agreements? What do you think?
Okay. So, well, that's a good question, but I think the right word will not be to weaken IP protections. As I have highlighted at several points in the presentation, you need to realize that even though we say that we are on an equal level, sometimes by virtue of the resources we possess or the skills or the economic background, you know that you are really not equal. So instead of saying to weaken, I would rather say to take measures that would give you the advantage. So if you necessarily have to, so in intellectual property laws, for instance, sometimes you need the permission or the consent of the right holder to use their work. So if you want to use information on, even say someone has come up with a very simple way of adding value to cocoa, using cocoa because that's been one of the focus we've used throughout the session. But if someone has come up with a very simple, say ordinarily adding value to cocoa takes 3 days, and someone has come up with a means to add value to it within 3 hours. So they have some form of protection over it. So as the right holder, whenever you need to use that means or whatever they've come up with within the 3 hours, sometimes you would, or most times you would need their consent to do that. One of the ways you can put yourself in an advantaged position is that you would say, okay, yes, we acknowledge that we need your consent to do that, but can you waive it in situations like when there's I'm going to use extremes, but say when there's a famine or when there's drought or when nationally we need to do things within a certain time frame. So then, yes, the right holders have their rights over whatever they've come up with, but then also you're able to easily get some form of benefit or place yourself in some form of advantage without necessarily breaking intellectual property laws. So you don't say, okay, I need it in 3 hours. Okay, I'm going to do it and get it in 3 hours. And then you'd end up breaking the rights holders rights, basically like going contrary to his rights. But then in those instances, you have the permission you need. So twist it in a way, or when you're having your agreements, when you're having your relations, trade relations, put your foot down, bring out what would benefit you, negotiate on those terms so that you are not necessarily weakening the laws or breaking the laws, but you have um put the clauses or the relevant terms that will benefit you, and then you don't end up being the disadvantaged party in relation to whatever agreement is going on. Sometimes you have to look weak. Maybe you would use the word because you think that you are losing some of your rights as an intellectual property holder, but sometimes losing those rights or waiving certain parts of our rights is what would give you the advantage that you need. So that would be the point that I would rather make. So instead
Mm.
of letting it go,
Okay.
just negotiating to help you.
Mm. Mm. Okay. Okay. That is great insight. Okay. I would like to like follow up on this quickly on a very like similar issue, right? So you did mention sometimes that the EU has some regulations that they would require these exporting nations to follow. For example, when they want to export things like their cocoa and palm oil and coffee and stuff like that, right? Um, the arguments that we've heard these nations make, the exporting nations, is that the compliance costs falls on them when they have to make sure that their farmers are meeting all of these strict environmental standards before they can export their goods to the European market, right? So it raises the question that in these trade instances where you have a lot of these requirements, are they really genuine climate policies that is coming from the first world nations to the nations they are dealing with that are exporting, or is it functioning really as just like a new form of trade protectionism that they are just disguising to us to these nations and in our part of the world as oh, it's just climate action, but probably they just want to protect their own industries there, so they want to stress you out a little bit. What do you think?
Okay. So with this, people like there's a group of people who would like to argue that when certain countries do not want to gain certain produce from you anymore, they come up with certain laws to make it look very legitimate, or with this with the whole climate action going on, we all want to be in the right frame, protecting our environment, ensuring that everything is in the right position. So sometimes, for instance, the EU would put in measures to prevent certain things from coming. Yes, there are two sides to it, as I've always maintained that you need to look at both sides and then take a stand. So it might be true that they might be taking these actions to protect the environment. So maybe there's emissions, or there's some form of um yes, carbon emissions, or there's some form of danger, maybe danger to the rights of children, there's labor laws being violated and all that. But sometimes it might be to protect them. So people argue that, oh, for instance, the EU has used a lot of or not EU per se, but developed countries had to rely on, say, fossil fuels and all of that to build their economies, to build their countries. And all of a sudden they're like, no, not anymore. We don't need such fossil fuels. We don't need all of that. So let us move to EVs. So what happens to countries that are mainly going to be exporting in that sense? So yes, okay, you are moving towards electric, or more towards another region. So then it will affect the person or a country whose main supply, because as I mentioned at the beginning, with the comparative advantage, you focus on what you have to develop or to send out there. So that's what they've been focusing on. And now all of a sudden, developed countries know that we do not need that anymore. It's causing danger to our environment and all of that. So sometimes it might seem that they've taken advantage of the resource, have no need for it, and then have moved on to the next. And then now it seems like they are just finding a way to protect themselves from they are finding a way to protect themselves from, those having to trade with those countries in that sense. And even with that, people also argue that it's not always right, because sometimes, that even if they put in measures like no carbon emissions, so we're not going to get imports or exports of certain things because of the carbon emissions, for instance. And then there's also carbon selling. So people have to, okay, they are foreign nations that know that they will not be able to limit their carbon emissions to a certain point, would um, buy or sell these credits, to enable them to do further. And so then it kind of goes against the very reason why you did not want to involve or relate with another person, because you're still sending out the same level of emissions, for instance. So it could be both ways. Sometimes it is for climate related issues, because there's a lot of climate action going on, and it has raised very serious concerns about how we approach our environment and how we protect our environment. But sometimes it's just to protect or shield their industries from getting, say, cheaper exports, or from getting um from gaining certain commodities from other countries. Yes.
Okay. So that is the dynamics in that conversation then. So it's not exactly intentional. that they are trying to go on full-scale protectionism, but they just genuinely sometimes care about these reasons. I think that makes
Yes.
sense. Okay, I think that makes sense. Just
I
like
mean,
any
not everybody will agree, but there are times when it's genuinely to protect the environment. Yes.
okay, let's hope that's true then. All right. All right. Okay, one last question I would want to add up on this is we've seen that like some countries have actually nationalized some industries that they have, especially like resources that they use to export. So quick examples is Indonesia restricted their exports of raw nickel, right? And Chile and Mexico, for example, they've increased their state control over lithium because they've realized that in the new EV industry and markets right now, lithium is very strategic for electric vehicles. So they would rather not send all of it outside for the rest of the world to buy cheaply. So they are probably looking into making their own batteries. So it raises the question then, should nations, right, especially like developing nations that usually rely on exports of their raw materials, should they try to nationalize their strategic resources? Is that something they should do? Would it have any repercussions on them if they do so?
As I mentioned, states have sovereignty over their territories, so they have control or they have the right to do with their resources as they please without external control. So Ghana, within the territories of Ghana, the government of Ghana, the state of Ghana can decide to limit the export of gold, as you've mentioned that some countries have limited the or have gained control over lithium because of its benefits to the now booming electric vehicle market. So, yes, countries can nationalize some of their resources, focus on it, focus on taking control over it. It's actually ideal to do that because, in a sense, you'd be benefiting from the natural resources you've been endowed with. That's, as I mentioned earlier, that if you have a resource and you are not taking advantage of it, it's it's equal to not having the resource. The resource is in existence, but you're not getting any benefits from it. You're not gaining any, you're not developing it. You're not gaining other resources from it. It will just be a resource you possess and not a resource you benefit from. However, in international trade or in global trade, you realize that you, the actions you take over your resources or your products should not be actions that are seemingly weapons against other countries. So I'll give you an example. Maybe the US has the largest EV production or manufacturing in the world. And then maybe Mexico has the largest lithium production in the world. And US necessarily needs the products from Mexico. And Mexico says we're taking control, we are exporting lithium, but not to US. It feels like um, a targeted attempt to prevent US from gaining access to the lithium, either to cripple their booming EV markets or just to retaliate, or not retaliate, but just to um, frustrate US or just as like a weapon or an attack on the US. So even as you take control or nationalize on your products, on your goods, on your services for the benefits of your country or for even if the benefit is not immediate, but because of the foreseeable benefits, it should not be one that is discriminatory against other countries. And sometimes you can also nationalize for public purpose. So yes, maybe Ghana is exporting so much cocoa that everybody now has a cocoa farm. And then when they cut down the trees, it leaves the land bare or something. So now for the safety of Ghana, we necessarily have to take control over the cocoa so that people are not harvesting for export purposes, and then we still have like the necessary forestry we need in our region to survive as Ghanaians or as citizens of Ghana. And also, so for nationalization of resources, you need to think of three things. It should be for public purpose. So as I mentioned, you need it to survive. You need it for the safety of the people of Ghana. It should be non-discriminatory. So you're not nationalizing because you don't want some country to have access to a resource, or you're trying to in in a way in a way cause a disadvantage to another country. And then also in some cases it ought to be accompanied by prompt, adequate, and effective compensation. So Ghana has a relation, or there's a treaty between, say, Ghana and Switzerland, that we produce them with cocoa always for their chocolate. So even maybe on their chocolate, on their branding, they always put the cocoa sourced from Ghana. That's like the agreements we have between them. And then now we necessarily need to nationalize or take control of our cocoa. So send them we can't send them any cocoa, unfortunately, for our own good or for whatever reason. We can't send them any cocoa. Then immediately we need to compensate them. We know that maybe every year Switzerland is raking in 100 million say dollars or 100 million euros from the chocolates they are making. And then now we say, oh no, we can't give you the cocoa. We compensate them immediately. It should be as immediate as possible. It should be adequate. We can't know that they are making as high as 100 million dollars or euros from the chocolate, and then they are going to lose this revenue. And then now in compensating them, we say we'll give you $1,000. It's not adequate enough, and it has to be effective. If we are not compensating them with cocoa, but maybe they have need for another resource that we can give them, we can also give it to them so that the compensation is effective. It should be one that would not disadvantage or cripple the economy or cause any um problem to the relation we have between them. So these are the things that I need to look at when you want to nationalize. So nationalization in itself is not bad. It's sometimes the approach to it and the aim of the nationalization. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that answer, but I think it's a bit tricky. So, the nation that used to sell to you, like we used to sell our cocoa to Switzerland, in the instance where
Right.
we decide to nationalize the cocoa, you're saying that we need to try to compensate them for losses that they might make. Now, this is very interesting because I used to think. And you did cover this at the beginning of your presentation that, nations in trade are all sovereign and equal. And I generally like to think that just because we are trading with you, we don't have to, it's not a promise or a guarantee of an end in future supply. So isn't it unfair then on developing nations to expect them to compensate nations that they used to export their resources to the moment they decide to nationalize and not give these resources out anymore?
Okay, so I would answer your question in two wings. So it's not necessarily always the developing states having to compensate the developed states. Sometimes the developed states would have to compensate the developing states. So in a case where Switzerland says, no, we're not going to take cocoa from Ghana anymore, then now Ghana that has to export all the cocoa we have. What do we do with our cocoa? We have no other countries to send our cocoa to. Just for this scenario, we have no other country to send our cocoa to. What do we do with the cocoa we've produced? We know that in October we have to give you cocoa. We've planted the trees, we have grown them ready to be given to you in October, and in March you're telling us you can't take the cocoa anymore. So then that's the disadvantage it poses to us as a developing nation. So then you'd have to compensate us. So it's not always a one-way stream where it's the developing nation compensating the developed nation. Sometimes it's the developed nation compensating developing nation. Now, to the issue of why you should compensate, especially since we are a sovereign state, we have control over our resources and we choose what we can do with it. There there are laws for a reason. Sometimes, and not sometimes, more often than not, before there's trade relations between states, they come to an agreement, they sign documents. There might be certain clauses or certain important things in there that you necessarily might should not breach. So, for instance, we know that between us, we have an agreement to produce either chocolate with your cocoa or to send cocoa to you. And then now we it's supposed to last for 3 years. And before, if you want to make an attempt to say breach it, you need to give maybe 3 months notice to terminate, not breach, to terminate. You maybe need to give 3 months notice. Now, here's the case where it's year one or we just entered the second year. You urgently need to nationalize. You need to nationalize. You can no longer send the cocoa to Switzerland, or Switzerland can no longer produce their chocolates with your cocoa. You urgently need to nationalize. So you do not intend, or yes, you are going to terminate the agreement, but sometimes not from something you have control over. Or say, let me use the floods. You needed to send something over to Switzerland. There's issue of flooding. So instead of maybe planting certain trees or certain, taking advantage of certain resources you have to send over, you necessarily have to switch over to another so that you survive as a nation. So you would have to give them that compensation that they need. It's just so that you are not in breach of whatever agreements we have between the two of us. But let me use everyday activities to explain this better. So, I have an agreement with you that on every Monday afternoon, you are responsible for sending over my lunch and maybe specifically fried rice with chicken. Then you always do so every Monday, but you realize that next week, Monday, you can't bring me chicken because for some reason there's no chicken available to you, or there's a ban on eating chicken where you source your chicken from. So you can't bring me chicken on Monday. But so you come to me, you say, okay, I can't bring you chicken on Monday. So I would have to unfortunately take control over the food. And now you say, okay, I would bring you sausage instead. So that's effective compensation because like, okay, sausage replaces the chicken. But then what if in that case, I don't even want the sausage at all. You don't even have any other thing to give me. So now you can't even bring me lunch on Monday. But I might have paid you as far back as March to give me um lunch till December. So now for that day when I'm not getting my lunch, you should give me some form of compensation, right? And sometimes maybe you will not be able to give me, so we're in July. So you know that it's not possible for you to give me for the whole of July and August. But I've already sorted this out with you in March. So in July and August, you'd have to compensate me. So it's not to say you no longer have control over your resources, or not to say you no longer have we are no longer a sovereign state. No, it's just so that we maintain the trade relations one, and sometimes to prevent certain nations from taking advantage of other nations. Because yeah, I have the products, I have control over who I can give it to, so I don't want to give it to you. And sometimes, and it's also like the fried rice. Maybe I paid you 30 cedis, then now you have somebody who says I can give you 60 cedis. You might be tempted to go there, but then because of the agreements we have, you would stick with me. And if you necessarily have to go there, I get the compensation that I need or should come to me. So that's it. It's not to take advantage of anybody, not at all. It's just to ensure that whatever agreements we have, we stick to it and the laws are followed through and through.
Mm, okay. Okay. I think I have more clarity on that issue then. Um, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that up for me. Hmm. Okay, I think with this we have almost everything covered that we need to know. I think what's left is for us to just probably go through the slides that will be attached to this video afterwards in the group description and the video description, I mean, and then just watch everything from the beginning to the end. Thank you for your time, and this has been a very insightful session, and hopefully for the other remaining sessions in the series, they would be equally as insightful. And beyond summer holidays IV and for the tournament, Vacationspars members and other people of the debate community would get to watch this video and take a lot from it. So thank you for your contribution. We really do appreciate.
Thank you too for this session, and hopefully
Okay.
we have more in the months to come. And I hope this is useful to everybody that got on the session as well. Thank
Yes, yes, I hope it would be. Okay, thanks. Bye, everyone.